Hello, and welcome to another episode of Legacy's Allure, brought to you by MTG Training Grounds, the educational series dedicated to providing you with all the info on popular decks, strategies, insight, and more for the Legacy format. I'm your host, Zachary Cuck. Legacy has evolved a great deal over its many years. One of the most notable shifts is towards a creature-centric, more interactive playstyle characterized by efficiency and flexibility. Throughout the format's life, many creatures have held the title of the best creature in Legacy. But in 2012, with the release of the Return to Ravnica set, the crown was taken by what many consider to not only be the best creature in Legacy, but in all of Magic. The creature is, of course, the infamous Deathrite Shaman. Today's episode, we're going to focus on this powerhouse one-drop and the surprising amount of influence it has had on the Legacy since its printing. Joining us today is a Legacy specialist with plenty of experience playing both with and maneuvering around Deathrite Shaman. He boasts an impressive collection of Legacy performances, including a top 4 at the 2015 Eternal Weekend Legacy Championship, a top 64 at the 2016 Legacy Grand Prix in Chiba, top 32 at Star City Games Philadelphia, runner-up at the 2016 SCG Legacy Open in Worcester, and just this past weekend, he was the runner-up at the Star City Games Team Open in Atlanta with his teammates Jim Davis and Dan Jessup. He's a writer for Legit MTG and has been featured as a recurring guest commentator on the Snapcasters Twitch streams. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming today's guest, Kevin King. Kevin, welcome to Legacy's Allure.
Hey, thanks for having me.
Awesome. So, like I said, we're going to be talking about Deathrite Shaman, and I know you're more like a lands player, but I'm sure as any Legacy specialist, you've encountered the creature quite a bunch, and like I said earlier, you've had to deal with both playing against it, like trying to maneuver around it, and all of its wealth of abilities, and also I know being a friend of Noah Walker's, you've messed with the cards some yourself. So let's dig right in. Let's talk about Deathrite Shaman. First, why don't you run us through Deathrite Shaman's stats? Tell us like what set he's from. Well, we already said what set he's from, but let's tell his card type, power, toughness, CMC, all that stuff.
Sure. So Deathrite was originally printed in Return to Ravnica, and it was pretty much a game changer from the get-go. So it's a hybrid black-green, which is a really big thing for its mana cost for a 1/2. So that's already a little bit ahead of the curve, but its creature type as an elf is relevant. It's an elf shaman, and it has 3 tap abilities. One of them is you tap exile a target land from a graveyard to add 1 mana of any color to your mana pool. So that one you activate for no mana. The 2 other ones require a mana. There's black and tap to exile target instant or sorcery card from a graveyard for each opponent to lose 2 life, not target opponent, each opponent. And then the green ability is green and tap, exile target creature card from a graveyard, and you gain 2 life.
Right. So that is a ton of stats and a ton of abilities on a 1-mana creature. And I think it's worth noting that you don't see cards like this printed typically outside of like Planeswalkers and some like more casual friendly artifacts, right? Something that has like multiple activated abilities on a single card.
Right, and none of them really for 1 mana like this one. It's so efficient for something with so many abilities.
Right. Another quick thing that I think is worth noting about all these activated abilities is like you said, all of them require the creature to tap. Deathrite Shaman has to tap. So none of his abilities are active the turn you cast it. Right. It has to get past the summoning sickness portion of its life. But after that, none of them have the hanger then either, that it can only be activated as a sorcery, so that he's incredibly flexible with regards to timing.
Right, it's almost unfair when people make the joke that it's a 1-mana planeswalker, in that it's an instant speed planeswalker, so you can sandbag it, wait to see what your opponent does, and then activate your best mode at the end of their turn with all perfect information. Right,
and we'll get into a little more later on about how to utilize Deathrite Shaman really well, but that, like you just alluded to, that instant speed interactive effect of it is actually, it almost gives it like a 4th mode in a lot of ways, where like you have the damage, the gain life, and the mana making, but you can sort of utilize your Deathrite Shamans proactively to be like an offensive creature. You can also use them very reactively to sort of mess up your opponent's game plans, and that's a very like at first glance, that's not the obvious like utilization, but it's actually very, very important, I think, in Legacy as a whole. So, go ahead.
The fourth ability is almost not using it.
Yeah, it's the classic.
The fact that you could is a real big threat.
Yeah, I think it's the classic Liliana the Veil style thing where she has the fourth 0-mana ability where you just do nothing,
right?
And just let her ride out. You don't have to activate it. That's So anyway, let's before we go into all of the nuance of playing the card, let's talk about what kinds of decks play Deathrite Shaman. Where will you see it, and what types of strategies, what types of decks?
So the biggest meta share is definitely in Grixis Delver. That was it's a really big include. It's a 1-mana spell that does anything you want. It powers out your True Name or Click on turn 2. It provides a clock. It disrupts Snapcaster Mage. It gains life against burn, which is kind of tough for a lot of Daze decks. So it's a big powerhouse there. It can draw Wrath of God effect all by itself when you play it in the Delver decks. Elves plays it as their 1-drop. It accelerates them. It is an elf. It's a way to close out a game. It's a way to chip away some damage so that you don't have to Crater Hoof for 1,000,000. It doesn't target, so it gets around. Not anything anybody's bringing in against elves, I guess, but it's a versatile threat. It's a plan B for the elves deck. There's some blue fair decks that are playing it. I actually think it's near its worst in there. It is a 1-mana thing that it powers out a Leovold if you're on the proactive Leovold plan, but there it's just a threat. It's another threat in your control deck that casts your Jace early, it casts your Leovold early. It's played in all sorts of bug decks. There's a couple of bug combo, bug value. Shardless has kind of gone by the wayside in favor of Food Chain and Allure and bug just sort of Leovold value that you wouldn't quite call a check pile or control list. And really, it's just if you're playing black and green, especially with blue, it's so good. If you've got a 3-drop you want to cast, you can cast it with them. If you don't have a 3-drop you want to cast, you can add some 3-drops because you're going to be able to cast them on turn 2.
Yeah, that's so. One thing I've noticed in all of the decks you mentioned, it's like you said, they either are looking for an efficient threat, which at its surface, it's just a 1/2 creature, so it doesn't look like a super efficient threat. But the black 2 damage untargeted ability is actually like a decent enough amount of damage, the way most Legacy games typically play out between fetch lands, Force of Wills, that kind of thing. That like you won't solely kill someone with a Deathrite Shaman very often, but you can pretty easily get 6 to 8 damage out of him. And for 1 mana and over the course of turns and all the flexibility it provides, that's actually like a really good rate, I'd say.
It really is. And then if you've got, say, a sorcery speed combo deck that you're trying to leave up all your mana in order to be able to cantrip and cast your counter spells and your thought seizes and such, Deathrite just sits there. It is mana if you need to cast the card counterspell, for example, and if you don't, then it's another 2 damage to the face without having to commit a lot of mana to the board in the form of a True Name or some other creature that you actually have to pay for. Turn 1, nobody's really turn 1ing you, so you got a window to drop your Deathrite, and you can ride that same Deathrite all the way out if you want.
Right, and you alluded to this. This is one of the things I think is really notable because I think the primary use is kind of like you said. It allows you to hold up mana. So he's kind of a noble hierarch, Birds of Paradise. Like he is a mana dork, or the classic like the bird or whatever they call it, and that is, I would say, the primary function of Deathrite Shaman, especially like in the first maybe 3 to 4 turns of the game. He's making mana, he's accelerating whatever your game plan is, or at least providing the ability for you to advance your game while still leaving up your reactive elements. And the reason that's such a big deal, you could say, well, that's Hierarch does that, Bird does that. Why is this so important? And I think even more so than him having all these other abilities, is that he's actually just a black creature. And this is an effect that almost exclusively used to exist on green creatures. Like you could only get it via a 1 mana green drop, and now it's on a black creature. And that's a huge deal.
Yeah, and some of these decks don't even play a green source.
Right.
To gain life. Some play 1 just like as a token because a lot of Deathrite decks have trouble with burn. Well, a lot of decks have trouble with burn. But that's the great thing about Deathrite is it's never irrelevant. It's a black creature, which aren't really known for their flexibility so much as their power. And you get a lot of 2-for-1s, you get a lot of skin render effects, a lot of Necrotals. out of black, but not a lot of mana dorks, as you say, or ways to gain life. It's a green mode, sure, but it's almost free in most decks, and it gives you game one flexibility against really aggressive decks. The black mode gives you game one flexibility against combo, against people who are trying to use Snapcaster or Past in Flames. It's almost like a sideboard card that is so good you want to play it in your main.
Yeah,
it's almost incidental the effect it has on your opponent's gameplay. And the green mode eats reanimator targets. It's so good. It's a 4 of sideboard card you put in your main.
Right, and all of these decks that we mentioned, especially the like you said, sort of the black X Delver. So basically black blue Delver plus add a color, whether it be Grixis or like the bug or Sultai color ones, or even the ones that were stretching hard for just like full on 4 color. Deathrite Shaman was really the card that enabled that because he made it so that you didn't have to fetch up or have access to duals of every color. You could pretty much limit yourself to like Volcanic Island and Underground Sea and still have access to green mana when you needed it, or if you got Wastelanded, you still had red mana when you needed it, all that kind of thing. And it's just so flexible in that regard, being a black creature in a deck that probably wants to have black cards anyway. So.
I mean, even this weekend, I died to exactly that play. I had wasted my opponent off of all their red sources, but I was dead to a lightning bolt. And in response to my Tabernacle trigger with no lands in play, Deathrite ate a land, made a red, bolted me in the face, and I died. That was in top 8. There's just no reason that a main deck card should have that kind of flexibility other than this really elegantly designed 1-drop that goes in every black deck pretty much that's trying to have a fair strategy.
Exactly. Now, that's another thing worth noting is every deck you mentioned, regardless of whether it's like Allure or Food Chain where they have an actual combo kill element, they're all, or even Elves, which like a lot of people would argue is first and foremost a creature combo style strategy, but also has like a very, very grindy element. They're all much more fair decks than what we think of as like traditional combo or very unfair strategies.
Right, and I mean it's powerful enough that Elves, along with Abrupt Decay and Cabal Therapy, is playing black.
Yeah.
Even if they to better enable their fair strategy.
Right. So, I mentioned earlier or in the intro that at least in my opinion, Deathrite Shaman is the best creature in Legacy. It just does so much and has so much value and flexibility that like maybe not on the like raw damage kill a player strategy. I mean, clearly you could give that title to like Grizzlebrand or Emrakul if you want, but like of creatures that you can reliably cast and offer you like the kind of flexibility in gameplay that like seems to be best in Legacy, or sort of the biggest share of the metagame, Deathrite Shaman certainly like holds the title.
For sure. I'm tempted to, I love Snapcaster. I'm tempted to say it's something like Snapcaster, but Snapcaster costs 2 mana plus whatever you're casting. It costs so much mana that it just isn't in all these decks. And so the cool thing about Deathrite is that it's in the Jace the Mind Sculptor decks, but it's also in the 1-2 mana cap decks. It does everything in every deck, as long as you're not. I guess it works in Elves because it is an Elf, but unless you're trying to enable a combo, it's probably going to contribute to your game plan.
Yeah. So we'll just go through sort of the aspects of Deathrite Shaman that make it Legacy's best creature. First off, we started to talk about the fact that it's a mana fixer, but even more so than a mana fixer, it's kind of it's mana ramp. It does what Birds of Paradise and Noble Hierarch did prior to Deathrite's printing, is it gets you from turn 1 mana to turn 2 3 mana, which is where a lot of the really heavy hitting cards in Legacy are, right? Like, I mean, you have some heavy hitters at cheaper mana costs, and a lot of those are like your counter spells, your removal. But the creatures that get people, into really tight positions and threaten their life total with like great efficiency, a lot of those are 3 mana. Like, so going from basically skipping a turn is a huge deal.
Right. Even Young Pyromancer is best as a 3-drop at least.
Mm-hmm.
So you start thinking about that. Everything in a creature deck in Legacy, as you said, is pretty much a 1 or a 3. And so these 2s are just really, really dead turns. A lot of times it's Ponder then Delver, or it's 1 then 1. There aren't a lot of decks that go 1 2 3. There's a lot of decks that go 1 3 if they can, or 1 1 1 3. and Deathrite enables all of that. Plus, Deathrite lets you, for example, take your own turn off and still develop your mana. So if you keep a land light hand, as long as you can protect it from a lightning bolt, for example, your hand is now more quality dense than your opponents, who had to keep a land for every one of the mana they want to use. Or for example, if you get wastelanded, you're protected against wastelanding. If you want to use a wasteland, you're now ahead in that you still get to have your 2 mana on turn 2 plus the wasteland, especially if you eat the land that you just wasted out of their own yard. It's velocity for free even when you want to take the turn off to do something else.
Yeah, I think that's actually a really good point. The interaction with wasteland, both beating wasteland and enabling it. Deathrite really effectively does both. And like you said, like you can take a wasteland. Like, I mean, it almost feels terrible to do something like that. If your opponent was, say they were on the play and they like, turn 1 ponder and you go turn 1 Deathrite, if their turn 2 play is like wasteland your land, they're like, you're still at mana parity. Like, you still have a guy that makes mana and they have nothing, and your guy does even more than just make mana. But like, it just feels terrible because like they didn't actually get that like huge tempo gain that they typically want out of a wasteland, and you could very well go into your next turn and return the favor by wasting them out, and then you're just like ahead. So it's really brutal, like the way he combats the strategy and enables it at the same time.
And it's really interesting how many different strategies Deathrite blanks effectively by accident. Same like that. Goblins, for example, you can't be attacking with a 1/1 into a 1/2 mana dork that everybody wants to play. That's just total splash damage. That isn't at all what the card is in the deck for. But it's at tempo. You can't have an opener where your best card's a 1/1 that won't be blocked, because it will be.
Yeah, that's actually one of the things that when I talked to Jim Davis for the Goblins episode, he mentioned that he felt that like, in addition to sort of the way Legacy was shifting anyway, Deathrite sort of was the nail in the coffin for the archetype in a lot of ways, because even though you still have game against some of the decks that it used to, like, it's still good against the old, the sort of the old guard of decks that are still around. Deathrite Shaman and decks that play it, they shut off Goblin Lackey, and they kill your velocity in that deck that you sort of needed to compete with the other creature decks. And I can't think of any other decks right offhand, although I imagine something like Temur Delver suffers pretty bad from that, because one of their threats, at least in the like very early stages of the game, is somewhat blanked again by a 1/2, and Deathrite actually goes even beyond that by keeping their yard small, so that Nimble Mongoose never actually reaches threshold either. So it's kind of a wonder that creature still sees any play, but Deathrite Shaman is certainly the reason for it, I think.
Right, it's a bit of one of those, if you can't beat it, it's probably because you should be playing it sort of situations.
Yeah, and I mean, your 1-drops, there can only be so many that are like good enough, and one
right.
died as one came in.
Exactly, and that's totally fine. I mean, I think the newer strategy of fair cards has sort of necessitated that anyway. Delve creatures that cost a virtual 1, both Mandrills and Gurmag. I mean, Gurmag himself made a whole thing different. You can keep your opponent's Gurmag slower with Deathrite, which is another secret mode. But yeah, I don't see how Rug Delver, it just doesn't pair up anymore now that Deathrite and Friends are just blanking almost everyone. Goyf is blanked by Gurmag, Mongoose is blanked by Deathrite.
Yeah, so there's another card that surprisingly combos well with Deathrite. See, so Gurmag Angler is a black creature, so like it fits well into this deck that wants to play this 1-drop effectively black elf creature. And you would think, well, all of Deathrite Shaman's abilities require, eating cards out of a graveyard, so like, isn't that going to hurt your delve possibilities? But in general, it doesn't, because Deathrite Shaman isn't even limited to your own graveyard, which might seem more natural, right? Like, if the card had been designed such that you had to put the cards in your own graveyard. But nope, he's just going to go after your opponents, sort of disrupt their delve threats while leaving yours, free reign, which is just insane.
Yeah, I mean, I understand why they did it. I bet they were trying to solve a couple of problems, and they found a really elegant way to do it. They, like I was talking about the main deck sideboard cards, how that seems very powerful. It also seems kind of necessary sometimes in a format where there's so much unfair happening. it can be a really delicate balance to make a fair deck that can beat another fair deck that still beats unfair. And so this was a big tool for the ability to do that. It used to be you had to sort of just go under, like the Rug Delvers. You just stifle their fetches and hope they never cast Sneak Attack, or Ad Nauseam, or whatever the combo deck happens to be. Deathrite accelerates you into that strategy if it is still just, attack them to death. It helps you get your mana for your counters. You hardcast Force a good bit because you need to save every Force and blue card you can. It changed, and depending on what your combo is, it might eat your your tutor out of the yard. It might eat your creature out of the yard that you were trying to reanimate.
And
so it was
can just keep you off threshold too, like for Cabal or Cabal Ritual and those kind of things.
Exactly. Yeah, it was this big toolbox that I guess that's why we got so many relevant modes on one card. Was they tried to solve a lot of problems with one creature.
Exactly. So let's move on from his mana abilities into his sort of offensive capabilities, which, I mean, clearly he's a 1/2, so he can attack, but I don't think that's what we mean here. He's not offensive because he can deal a point to a planeswalker or whatever. He's offensive.
I took a couple of damage this weekend.
I mean, yeah, it happens. Like, especially when you don't have any mana to spare, you might as well keep cracking. But really, the black activated ability that deals 2 damage to a player or to all of your opponents. I think there's a couple really notable things here. Eating instants and sorceries out of a graveyard is really big in a lot of different ways. Most notably, probably is Snapcaster Mage. So I'll let you hit on it. So the advantage to not only that, but just all of the sort of the activated black ability. What are the traits that matter here? Like I said, in addition to sort of disruption.
Yeah. So Snapcaster is really interesting in that a lot of times you play Deathrite almost as a Grafdigger's Cage. You see a lot of people, they make the mistake exactly once of the reflexive end step, I'll eat the bolt out of your yard, and then your opponent responds with, okay, snap it back. You don't get the 2 life, and I bolted it. Whereas if they're playing Snapcaster, often the best thing you can do with a Deathrite is just leave it up with black mana. And now you've blanked it. Whatever Snapcasters are in their hand are now blanks, or Ambush Viper. And so that's a really interesting mode, is using the black is not even always the most powerful way to use it. But generally against a lot of decks, like you were saying, Threshold for Storm, you want to keep their yard as small as possible so their Cabal Rituals are bad. You want to eat Cabal Therapies out of the mirror, for example. If there's Cabal Therapy in the yard, a card with Flashback. You can eat, if their plan is Past in Flames, you can eat the important Ritual or Tutor that they were going to Past in Flames back. In mirrors, you can just you can do them damage while keeping their fish off the table for an extra turn, their Grimeg Angler. And if for some reason you've got a Glacial Chasm, there's a couple of effects that are usually hosers. Glacial Chasm prevents all damage, doesn't prevent loss of life. If you have a Leyline of Sanctity for some reason, because you're just this all-in combo deck or something, it doesn't target, so they lose 2. If you're playing 2-headed Giant, the team loses 4 because you have 2 opponents. So it kind of skirts around a couple of things that should be lights out for a fair creature deck.
Yeah, actually, I'm sure you have a lot of experience with the Glacial Chasm one, where that's really non-intuitive, when you first think about it, because it seems like the kind of card that would just say, like, you can't lose life, or I guess it couldn't say that because you have to pay life, but like it seems like you shouldn't be taking life loss other than that which you pay for the cumulative upkeep on the card. But like you said, loss of life is different than damage, even though damage causes loss of life. And,
right, we were really comfortable with Grim Lavamancer was the best option for this thing, but now it's not.
Yeah. Oh, and there's another creature that, like, still very, very useful. You definitely see it, get played and stuff, because that ability is still just, to be able to shock for virtually nothing repeatedly is incredibly powerful. But Deathrite Shaman inadvertently does what Grim Lavamancer does, but he does it a little bit better most of the time. And he fights Grim Lavamancer really well. Like he keeps it, the ability from being as usable or usable as often.
Right, 2 of your own cards at a time is way more difficult than any card in anybody's yard. One of. I have to think when they were designing the card, they just sort of wanted to color shift Grim Lavamancer. The success and the elegance of Grim Lavamancer was sort of a goal. How do we do that in other colors? And so maybe they made a black green Grim Lavamancer, and then they were like, well, what if we made a green Grim Lavamancer? What if we put them together? It's Golgari, right? So we can have a Golgari card for the clan plane, and we ended up with just very, very powerful card. I mean, in standard, so that's actually a thing that was you have to keep in mind is the standard they were designing it for. Lingering Souls was in that standard, so you had to be able to eat Lingering Souls out of the yard. They wanted to be able to interact with it in some way profitably on a card that was worth playing anyway.
Yeah, and the card, like, there was no fetch lands around, so it didn't seem quite so mana rampy. Potentially you could get it to make mana maybe like on turn 2 if you were lucky, turn 3 probably more reliably with things like the dredge style. I mean, they didn't have dredge in standard at the time, but things like that just like dumped swaths of cards in your yard. Yeah,
Ghost Quarter was in that standard, and so was Terramorphic Expanse and/or Evolving Wilds. So, like, if you really, really wanted it, you could have it. But if you Evolving Wilds, for example, you weren't up a mana; you were just not down a mana.
Right. I mean, it still would have given you the flexibility, right? But it wasn't just like strict mana ramp like it is with the real fetch lands.
Right. Exactly.
Well, let's see. We talked about the offensive capabilities. You've already sort of alluded to the main deckable Graveyard Hate, which I think is actually a really big deal because I haven't played Legacy as long as a lot of other players, but I've heard the horror stories of how Reanimator used to be, such an like a common problem. Like it was very, very powerful. The cards it plays haven't really updated in years. It's still using the same things it had available 5 years ago for the most part.
Right. Grizzlebrand was big for that deck, but otherwise, it's the same strategy, same card, same careful studies. It reminds me of how Sneak and Show is right now. It was just sort of like the sorcery speed combo deck, the non-storm combo effectively, and it used to be also Dredge was really, really big. Not, winning everything every weekend, but everywhere you went, you had to be ready for Dredge, and so it was sort of how Vintage goes, where your sideboard had to just be like 5 graveyard cards and then 10 cards you wanted the sideboard. And it wasn't a lot of fun, honestly, just having these 1 or 2 matchup cards in the board in significant numbers. You always had to play Tormod's Crypts. You always had to play Rest in Peace hadn't been printed yet at that point. Your Relic of Progenitus was out at the point I started playing Legacy. That was new. So Deathrite kind of flipped that on its head. You don't have to. I mean, it hurt those decks a lot, so you didn't have to dedicate as many slots. But also, it in itself is 4 slots of Graveyard Hate. So maybe you're playing 1 or 3 or something in your board.
Yeah, you just throw a pair of Surgical Extractions in with it, and then you're typically pretty good against most graveyard-based strategies, right?
Right. Exactly.
I was gonna actually say, in addition to fighting like Reanimator style decks, you're most notable for playing lands, and I would say Deathrite Shaman has got to be one of the best tools against lands.
I actually 0-5'd against Grixis Delver this weekend with lands, and I lost every single game in large part to either actually dying to Deathrite or being hamstrung by Deathrite sufficiently to die to other cards. I didn't lose a game where there was no Deathrite on the table, I guess is a good way to put it. It's really actually honestly the only thing keeping land fair. If it weren't for Deathrite, then the fair matchup would be so good that they'd have to sideboard 10 cards for us. It's just somehow I like that it exists because it means I'll get to keep playing lands for a while. They won't just ban Tabernacle or something.
Yeah, that's actually, if we can caveat just a second while talking about a ridiculously powerful creature, there are oftentimes complaints about like the power level of a certain card or the existence of a card that somewhat hamstrings or invalidates, or not fully invalidates, but makes life really rough for certain strategies. And I oftentimes wonder if people consider what the game or what their deck or the world would look like if this thing that bothers them so much as the thorn in their side didn't actually exist. Like, yes, it would give them all the power they want, but like, is that really what they want? Because like you just alluded to, if you were definitively unstoppable, that would just be the end of your deck. Because like that is how Wizards answers things. They either have a card that is a major thorn in the strategy that you're playing, or you get your deck banned. Because like you can't just let a strategy run rampant forever as like the strongest thing there is without recourse.
Right. Like I think the last the Treasure Cruise Dig Through Time luckily weren't banning a deck. They were just banning a card that never really should have seen the light of Legacy. But otherwise, yeah, no, they've just like Survival was busted, and they didn't ban Vengevine or anything. They banned Survival. Because if it weren't for Vengevine, there was going to be some other Vengevine. Legacy is just like a big enough format that you have to ban the card. And so, yeah, I think weirdly enough, for all the strategies it invalidates, pour one out for the ones it actually really invalidates. But if it weren't, I won't say Reanimator would be the best deck and everybody would have to play it, and it would be this whole Reanimator summer if we didn't have Deathrite. But Deathrite being so good against all these strategies makes it feel totally realistic that any Deathrite deck could beat any deck in the format, which makes any deck in the format effectively safe from bans, effectively safe and fair and fun to play against.
Right. And as long as Deathrite Shaman itself doesn't become so overpowered, like as long as it's like the top tier, like the decks that play it, and they're not oppressively powerful, then yeah, like you said, you don't have to worry about your strategy getting the axe, because there's always this Deathrite deck that, sort of keeps everything fair and in check, to an acceptable or what seems an acceptable level.
Right, and Deathrite doesn't contribute to the sort of games that we've decided as a community, and WotC has decided the character of Legacy is going to dislike. It does, and it's rightly banned in Modern, I would say. It's so powerful. It invalidates so many strategies on its face that it doesn't contribute to the Modern philosophy, the Modern format of I get to do what I want. We're going to interact a little bit and such, but I get to do what I want. Is not true in Legacy. There's no such promise. You may show up and not get to do what you want at all. I watched a game at the gunslinging event right before the Open. It was Revealed Double Chancellor, Land, Writ, Entomb, Exhume, Sire of Insanity on the play. So with double virtual days backup, put a Sire of Insanity in play, and both players had to discard their hand before player 2 went to play. And that's just... And if that gets too good, that gets too good, but that's held in check by... that deck doesn't go off turn 1 very often. Think of it like a turn 2 deck. Deathrite really, really puts a thorn in their side game 1. And that's sort of the glue that holds Legacy together is these trump cards that are good against everyone. Force of Will is the classic. Mm-hmm. But Deathrite is comparable, I'd say, in function to Force of Will in keeping decks fair by always having a way to interact with things that are designed not to be interacted with.
That's actually a really... I don't know how I haven't ever thought of this before, because I've heard the analogy before that like the two like push pins or the glue that holds Legacy together is Force of Will and Wasteland. Like those two cards guarantee that nothing too degenerate ever completely runs away with like the format. And I think you're correct. I think now that I like am internally processing this sort of on the fly, Deathrite is the third piece of that now. He's like the main deckable answer to the third like degenerate style of deck. You have like the spells degeneracy, which like Storm, Charbelcher, those kind of like cast a whole bunch of spells, make too much mana that are more than an acceptable amount of mana on the first 1 or 2 turns. Force of Will holds off. The like ridiculously powerful Cloud Posty style or Tron style ramp decks that would just run amok and crush all the mid-range decks are held in check by Wasteland, and Deathrite is like the final piece of that sort of says don't do ridiculous graveyard shenanigans, at least not too ridiculous. You can have a little bit of ridiculous.
I mean, it's on record that WotC, I don't know if it was WotC TM, official or anything, but they've said that the dredge was a mistake. Like the mechanic of dredge was a mistake, because it means that you're not playing Magic. You're playing Yu-Gi-Oh while your opponent plays Magic. You're just doing something with your graveyard. You're interacting in zones that the game was not designed to be interacted with. The game was designed for 15 years to be interacted with in play and on the stack. And so you decide, if my Life from the Loam gets countered, for example, I don't care. I don't care if you interact on the stack. I'm going to interact in play from my graveyard. And there just wasn't anything that really interacted with the graveyard. Like Terravore punishes you for milling yourself too many lands by attacking, but like there wasn't anything that just wholesale said, be careful with your graveyard. We're main decking, interaction now. And so Deathrite was, I like to think intentionally, sort of an answer to how powerful other zone strategies had gotten.
Yeah, and that's actually a good point, because like in the early days of Magic, the graveyard was sort of like the final resting place for all cards, right? If they were an instant or sorcery, once they left the stack, they had to go somewhere, and the graveyard was that, and that was just sort of like where they remained. I mean, you had a few things like Raise Dead type stuff that like you could get a creature back, and it was flavorful and thematic, but like in reality, all you were doing was like getting a card back to your hand. It was kind of like you were drawing a card from your graveyard, which is pretty benign when you have to recast things. But when they started to give you the ability to like recast them or utilize the graveyard as a resource more than just a like place to have, or a habitat for your expired cards, things like Delve and Flashback and like you alluded to, Dredge, that then interacted with other future sight mechanics like Narcomoeba and so on.
Right.
Then things got really nutty, and you thought, darn, maybe we pushed this like quote resting place too far into the resting resource zone, and now we need to patch that back up, and Deathrite does a very effective job of that.
Well, that's Legacy. So for example, if you look at Vintage, the things you can do in play are just so powerful that it incentivizes doing them. But Legacy, the most busted stuff is banned. So we get our value by using every piece of every zone. And so you look at a Legacy tournament, everyone's constantly looking at their graveyards. Every graveyard actually matters. And Deathrite's a huge part of that. I mean, so look at from the example of the original text on Plow said, removed from the game entirely. It wasn't Exile. Exile wasn't a zone. It wasn't a place you could cast your Griffins from. Put it in your shoebox. You can get it later, but it's not in the game at all. And then Exile became that. And I think the reason Exile became a game zone that, not necessarily interactive, but like a relevant game zone, was that the graveyard was being used so much as an active game zone as the game got more and more, and eventually they realized they had to recognize that explicitly. They had to start, and we still see a little bit of it, but nothing like Deathrite has ever been.
Right. Yeah. You have so much utilization and interaction with the graveyard as, like you said, like as an actual zone that matters. You kind of needed like Graveyard 2.0, which is kind of what Graveyard used to be. Like
exactly. And I mean, I think that was we got a little bit lucky in that they realized they had put a lot of so Innistrad, the first Innistrad, that was they were going for sort of a, not necessarily Eldritch horror as we saw the second time around, but like an old-fashioned werewolves horror. European tradition, spooky story kind of thing, and they were going to be using the graveyard a lot. Mm-hmm. Things like Lingering Souls and Unburial Rites. And so they realized that they'd have to, ahead of time, like prepare for that. They'd have to have a card that you already want to play. So call it Birds of Paradise. We want this card in decks anyway. The Birds of Paradise decks will also be able to interact with Lingering Souls and Unburial Rites and such. Otherwise, it'll just all be graveyard decks by the time we get to the Innistrad block. And then they printed the story, possibly apocryphal, is that Curse of Death's Hold. They printed Curse of Death's Hold to deal with Spirit Tokens, because they knew Spirit Tokens could get totally out of hand, and that it wouldn't be fun to play against Midnight Haunting and Lingering Souls at the same time. And they wanted Curse of Death's Hold to be played, but they clearly also wanted Deathrite Shaman to be played. And that's how Deathrite Shaman is said to have gotten the second toughness, is they didn't want Deathrite Shaman dying to Curse of Death's Hold.
And we mentioned earlier with its sort of like being like the executioner of an archetype, that extra point of toughness, but it goes so much further beyond that. There are, I dare say, there are a multitude, like a plethora of times where it comes up that seemingly for no reason any longer, like other than knowing the history of like the standard format, it seems like almost nonsensical that Deathrite Shaman has 2 toughness, because everything about him screams this should just be a 1/1 or a 0/1. Like this thing should be a Bird of Paradise, right?
I wonder a lot why it's not a 0/2.
Right. Like the fact that it can attack. Well, actually, no, not the fact that it can block and occasionally trade with things, I think, is insane sometimes.
An unflipped Delver, for example, it can trade with a Snapcaster if you get into that situation.
I mean, it can straight stonewall elemental tokens. Like until there's a sufficient number of them, he's basically like a one-man army holding off 3 tokens at a time.
So as you say, bare minimum 0/1 for this mana, these abilities. I feel like we might still play that card. I have a hard time imagining a world where we wouldn't.
Yeah, no, I agree. Abilities.
So think of a 1/2 with one very relevant ability for a split black-green. That's a solid card.
Yeah.
And yet we get 2 more very relevant abilities. There's no like, I'd say green never really gets used, but it gets used at least every tournament.
Oh yeah.
That you play the card. It's a very, very pushed card and kind of counterintuitively very healthy for Legacy.
I mean, in some ways that is what makes that's what makes a good Legacy, or like a good / healthy Legacy card is like a solidly developed card that was pushed too hard for Modern.
Exactly.
that's like right in the sweet spot.
Exactly. Fundamentally fair, but tons and tons. It's almost a modal creature if you think of it that way. It's a cryptic command creature.
I mean, another good example of like a card that sort of exactly meets the description we just made it or stated is Leovold, Emissary of Trest. Like he's clearly very pushed. His mechanics are designed to be powerful and I don't want to say interactive because he's actually kind of anti-interactive. Or I guess he's prison-esque in that he like screws with what your opponent can do. And I think a card like Leovold in Legacy or in Modern might be really dangerous. Like it might be really, really bad.
Right, and it's not even all that played in Legacy.
Right.
Like to give you an example, I think part of that says casting cost, right? So Deathrite costs a black or a green. Even if you like mull to 5 and you have to keep Trop as your only land in your Grixis Delver deck, that's awful, awful, awful. Except you've got a Deathrite. You just cast Deathrite and now you have whatever mana you want. You've used non-basic island to cast Birds of Paradise and you are in this game. And that's pretty unique.
Yeah, actually, in the Classic, I played against a guy who was on Sultai Death's Shadow, and he had to mulligan in one of the games, and the hand he kept, I think, had he had a singleton Tropical Island in hand, and the deck's very, very much just a black-blue deck with with a little bit of green splash, kind of like a lot of these decks are. And when he led out on that, it still made me reconsider, do I want to fetch on turn 1? Because like clearly he needed, it looked to me like he needed the black mana. And I was like suddenly at the point where I had to reconsider if I should be fetching on turn 1 or if I should, just play like, my own Tropical Island and avoid, offering him the mana, even though I wanted to get things underway. And that's just like, it's just so powerful.
Build your own time walk too. So, for example, this person could have had a black source in hand and wanted you to not fetch here. They could have, if you do fetch, you're time walking yourself into them having more mana than you next turn. If you don't fetch and you don't develop your game plan, you've just given them a turn to untap because you didn't want to accelerate them.
Right.
The threat of a Deathrite, as we were talking about earlier, is often worse than using it.
All right, so now we've sort of talked about like how people play Deathrite or what roles he fills in various decks, and in some ways we've mentioned like what effect it's had on the meta. Let's talk a little bit more about that. We mentioned that you now have like main deck graveyard hate, which is a very big deal. It's part of this trifecta we described. But what other effects has it had on the Legacy metagame sort of as a whole? What decks gained share of the meta? What decks lost? And what is sort of the new lay of the land as a result of Deathrite? Because I would say that there is very much a big influence on the way Legacy looks because of Deathrite's existence.
Absolutely. I mean, we talked a bunch about it's hurt Reanimator. It killed, not single-handedly, but it led to the killing of goblins. I'm sure somebody's going to watch who plays the goblins deck, and I really hope you never have to face Deathrite, and I hope you continue playing the deck you love. It's not dead. Nothing's dead in Legacy. You can play whatever you want in Legacy, but it's also really focused the Delver deck. So there was a long, long time ago when Noah first tipped me off to this Grixis Delver pile. it just looked awful. Everybody was playing Patriot Delver or Rug Delver at the time. And this thing just looked like this 18-color pile of garbage. And when we started playing with it, it became very clear that this was just the whole reason to do this was for Deathrite. This was before True Name was even printed. It was Young Pyromancer was good. That was a good card. We wanted to play it, but it was just a Delver Deathrite deck. And we were making all sorts of concessions to our mana base. We were playing effectively 4 colors plus 4 wastelands in order to make sure we could have this stupid Deathrite card nobody was playing. And it's not that nobody was playing it because it was bad, it's just there wasn't a deck for it. And it turned out that the correct strategy was make a deck for it. And that tradition has continued, that if you're going to play fair, you got to really make a case for why you're not playing Bug. And Bug includes all these Grixis decks with like Lightning Bolt and no other red.
Yeah.
If you're going to play Swords to Plowshares in your deck, you're already playing black, green, blue. It's really sort of invalidated a lot of the strategies you'd want to have. I mean, for a while there, we did have like a Stoneblade, Deathblade. It's coming back a bunch since Miracles, but you don't see white mana with Deathrite an awful lot.
No, I mean, one of the main reasons I think you even see it at all is because Esper, as like a control shell of colors for a control shell, is actually very well suited to what you're trying to do. It's very good at slowing the game down, disrupting your opponent both with counterspells, removal, and hand disruption, like all of the ways you normally go at it. And white, being able to play white gives you some of the best sideboard options there are as far as like graveyard hate or artifact and enchantment hate, just like the very, very powerful versions of it. And Deathrite being black, again, is the reason I think that you can even try to do those things.
But white, like your best removal spell is Plow, which actually isn't all that good for Deathrite. You activate Deathrite 3 times, you find ways to interact, and then you Plow a Gurmag Angler, and you're nearly, back to even. Rest in Peace is your best sideboard graveyard hate, but it hurts you, so you can't play Rest in Peace if you're playing a Deathrite deck, I would say.
Yeah.
Some do it. So even Deathrite itself sort of disincentivizes white. Deathrite isn't all that good with a weapon equipped. If you were going to play a Stoneforge deck, you have an equipment, you don't really want to be swinging with your Deathrite.
Right, because in order to do that, you have to tap him, and then his abilities are all turned off. So yeah, it's very counter-synergistic. Anti-synergistic, that's a word.
Yeah. Plus, the incidental damage that you get in with Deathrite over the course of a game, just sort of eating your opponent's brainstorms when you have the slots and just using it once a turn, it makes Bolt look a lot more attractive. There are a lot of games where just over the course of the game, they get to be at 6. You don't really do anything intentionally to get them there other than swing with the Delver while it's in play, but they end up at 6 somehow. And so that makes it really unattractive to want Plow in that deck.
Right. No, yeah, that's a very good point. Like you just what white does, or the color white is really good at in Magic, doesn't line up well with what Deathrite Shaman does. And I mean that kind of makes sense because it's white's wheelhouse should not overlap too much with what is effectively black's wheelhouse. Like the colors should be doing polarly opposite things in a lot of cases. So it stands to reason that they don't mesh well, but it further forces all of the decks in Legacy to sort of mold themselves into one of these types of strategies. And if you want to use Deathrite, which we're sort of arguing here you should, or is a very valid and strong strategy, then you kind of have to drop what white offers typically.
Right. It's almost a different card in the white decks in that you're not really trying to win the game with it a lot of the time so much as just make up for your plows. You're also using it as an acceleration. If you cast your Vindicate style card early, that can be a huge tempo swing that they never recover from.
Right. Yeah, like how Maverick uses it, for instance.
Right.
Okay. So, well, let's finish up with some of the strategy in utilizing Deathrite Shaman. Like I said, we keep hitting on some of these things like eating the cards out of your opponent's graveyard or holding them up to try and fight against Snapcasters. So first of all, with its abilities, because they're all instants, what are some examples, or what are the classic scenarios you get into where you want to use it either proactively or reactively? And do you use them your turn, your opponent's turn? Do you wait and not use them at all? What are like the sort of, if you can broad stroke, how to utilize Deathrite's abilities?
So I mean, the easy like level 0 strategy is just never activate it until you have to. Don't be afraid to use it as a Birds of Paradise. That's not saying, but never just eat their brainstorm and say go if there wasn't a reason to, say go first and then do it in their end step. And that's usually easy. If you're playing against aggro, you should consider eating creatures earlier rather than later, because you never know when it's going to get bolted that you can't answer. Leaving it up, we talked a little bit about earlier, leaving it up versus Snapcaster decks just kind of forever. You have to decide which one's more valuable. Is trying to close the door more valuable by getting that 2 damage in, or is it more valuable that their Snapcaster will never get, value? Often that's true, because often in the blue mirrors you want to go a little bit bigger, still be a tempo deck, but you don't want to be aggro against these bigger blue decks with Snapcaster. The most, really it's just whatever your strategy is right now, do that. And if you don't have any strategy right now and you're just sort of in the mid game where you're doing whatever comes to you, then you activate its black ability and you close the game out.
Right. So I would say that, like, sort of to summarize, you be as reactive as you can, but ultimately the kinds of decks that Deathrite is in, his function beyond just making mana is to facilitate the end, or is to like push towards the end of the game. So a lot of times the correct usage is going to be to use the black ability, try and like drop your opponent's life total while maintaining that reactive, stance.
Right. And you should always consider, like, is it better to use, for example, if you need the mana, you need 5 mana, one of it is going to be from your Deathrite to cast a Force of Will. And you're worried about some blowout line where they surgical the land that you targeted, or they Bojuka Bog, they rotate for Bojuka Bog for the land you targeted. Now you don't have 5 mana. You need to consider that. You need to actually, a lot of people forget that the first ability is not a mana ability, in the sense of the rules.
Right, it can be responded to.
And therefore is just an instant speed activated ability that produces mana. And so if the target becomes invalid, you'll have a lot of times people will, for example, even in the Deathrite Mirror, they'll say, tap 3, tap their Deathrite, pull a card out of your yard and put a 3-drop on the table. And you're like, whoa, wait a minute, back up. I have a Deathrite, and once you target your Misty, I'm going to target your Misty. You don't get that mana, and it's always a blowout when that happens. You need to be mindful, especially in mirrors, but even outside of the mirror, just, is there a way that this could go wrong for me?
Yeah, definitely. I know that's when I used to play like Bug Delver or Sultai Delver, I used to consider that when I'm activating my Deathrite like on an end step to try and get 2 points of damage in, it's sort of conventional wisdom to try and go after your opponent's graveyard. But if they haven't done much for the turn, you should respect the possibility that maybe whatever they didn't do, it is a way to like utilize that card that you're going after in their graveyard. Most notably Snapcaster Mage, but it could be something that could have been like back when Dig Through Time was still around. You had this instant speed way to delve and just exile the card right out from under Deathrite's nose. So you sometimes would consider, well, should I just exile something from my own graveyard to guarantee that this 2 damage happens, right? Because I don't want them to just, take my target away via some effect that they've got, in hand and still sort of a secret to me.
Right. And I mean, it's possible you want to walk them into a line, or more, I guess it's pretty obvious. So you want to like act like you're walking them into a line where, you've been eating all their instances and sorceries, and then you leave that K command, hopefully you can still answer it. Never leave a K command just for the bluff that they're not going to snap it back, because if they snap that K command, you've probably lost. But, you can, for example, if you're trying to surgical a card, you don't want to eat it with Deathrite. Even if your deck has surgical in it and you haven't drawn it yet, you should consider not eating it with Deathrite. That would happen a lot in these matchups where I'm playing lands, where they'll eat my lands and they'll eat Depths, then Elite Wastes. And I don't have a Loam, and I have shown no indication of having a Loam. And if I did have a Loam, they could eat it while I'm targeting with Loam.
Right.
But they keep eating them, and that's a valid strategy. I mean, it's possible that you just, like, there's too many lands in my yard, you need to eat some of them. But then they draw Surgical, and they can't Surgical any of these cards that are now in Exile, and they've sort of done that to themselves.
Yeah, another good one, or a good example, because Deathrite Shaman, it's sort of a very fine dance, because like a card like Punishing Fire will kill him. He's only a 1/2,
right?
Only. And Punishing Fire will finish him off. But if somehow you've managed to get to a point where Deathrite Shaman has survived, and the Punishing Fire, or he survived the Punishing Fire, you say you dazed it, or Force Willed it, or whatever, and it's in the graveyard. If the lands player does not have a Grove of the Burn Willows, they can't just get it back whenever they want. And you could just try and eat it out of the yard and protect all of your future creatures and that kind of thing. But like you're alluding to, it could be Surgical Extraction that you want to wait and get all of the copies so that they can no longer draw any of them. It might also be that you don't want to walk right into a crop rotation where they just like, surprise, here's a Grove of the Burn Willows, and you've not only wasted your ability, but now you're going to lose your Deathrite while you're at it. If you had just, again, like you said before, the sort of like next level Deathrite, if you just held it up and waited, they never could have like gotten away with it. Or at least not for several more turns till they naturally find a Grove.
A really pretty black and white example is against Show and Tell. If you Force of Will Show and Tell, and you have Surgicals in your deck, you really probably shouldn't be Deathrite eating that Show and Tell if you can help it, because okay, sure. If you had like Snapcaster Flashback Show and Tell, you got me. Like, your deck building is insane. You did it. But otherwise, you don't want to eat it. You want to leave it there for Surgical. So you might eat your own Ponder or something, like you were saying. Consider. Don't just mindlessly activate this card. It's a very complex card. Think about it when you do it.
Yeah, and that's I guess that's another one I've often heard. And I mean, I play Infect, so like, I don't have Snapcaster, or at least not any conventional version does. And my graveyard interaction is actually pretty minimal, which I think is one of the weaknesses that I hope sees some cards printed at some point to make it even better, is that I want to use my graveyard more too.
Right.
But a lot of times I will hear an opponent say, like, it's almost as if they acknowledge that I don't have much interaction, or they just don't care, or they're not thinking about it, but they'll say like, oh yeah, end of turn, activate Deathrite, get something out of your yard. And I'm like, so you want the Force of Will? Because like, that's a card I'm never going to recast or reuse. Or do you actually want like Brainstorm or Invigorate or something that maybe there's a slim chance I do actually have something, and you should have thought about that ahead of time.
Right, especially you wily Infect players are known for playing 1-ofs and 2-ofs of these whatever cards. I mean, that's the legacy, is you never know. I got Price of Progress out of Grixis Delver, which is just really, really counterintuitive, but really excellent. It was a great meta call from that player's perspective, and you have to respect that. And I think that's the same thing, that you have to respect that they might have a Snapcaster, they might have a main deck Surgical for some whatever reason. If you can afford to, just think about, before you activate your Deathrite, what goes wrong here. If is my opponent trying to, do I lose to a Gurmag? If I do lose to a Gurmag, maybe I want to main phase my Deathrite on their yard to try to keep them off a fish for the turn.
Good point.
It's a complex card. You gotta play it intentionally.
That actually leads into one final like little tidbit I want to talk about, because again, I don't, as an Infect player, and there are a fair number of decks like Death and Taxes and some of those that don't get to utilize their graveyard really at all. And in their mind, or in their approach to the game when they're playing against a deck with Deathrite Shaman, they need to sometimes think, how can I fight against this? How can I combat what Deathrite Shaman does? And that could be as simple as, like, in Death and Taxes case, I just like, I play Rest in Peace now, or I'm going to play, a Relic of Progenitus, or I'm going to have something in my deck that is incidentally very hateful against what they're doing and doesn't actually affect me at all, even though they're not like a quote graveyard deck, like they're not Reanimator, they're not, Dredge. It's still, depending on what they're doing, like I know when I play Death and Taxes it's very good against the like Shardless or like check pile Leovold bug style decks. You just bring in Rest in Peace, because they get so much incidental value out of their graveyard, most notably Deathrite Shaman, that a Rest in Peace is actually a huge hindrance to their overall game plan.
Right. I mean, there's some obvious ways to kind of get ready for one. If you've got a mana ready to cast a needle, you might needle it before it even hits play. You might cast it by the needle on Deathrite Shaman. You might cast yours first so that you have control over the mirror. The mirror is so complex. A lot of the times in the mirror, the right play is either have more Deathrites or never use it. Just ever. Like if they have a Deathrite, they've just put a by the needle on Deathrite in play. Is all they've done. So that's one way to get ready for it. Is if yours would be the weaker, you should play it first. You can obviously you can rest a piece away the yards. You can keep your yard small, but
I would say if you have delve threats like Gurmag Angler or I don't know if I'm trying to think if there are any other delve spells that see. Well, I guess there's Become Immense, but like other spells that utilize graveyard or can sort of keep what's in the graveyard in check. You might proactively consider what it is you're exiling, especially if it doesn't matter to you otherwise. I know oftentimes if I'm casting a Become Immense and it happens to not be lethal, like on the rare case where it's like a defensive Become Immense, then I get very, very picky with what I'm taking out. It's typically I'll leave a bunch of lands and take out all of the instants and sorceries that I can to proactively get rid of it. That way, they have a harder time. I mean, they'll have their own graveyard still, but that just makes it that much more difficult, like for their Gurmag anglers to show up and that kind of thing. So it's not like direct combat with Deathrite, but it is incidentally in it, and it's probably a percentage point.
Yeah, it's really interesting. It used to be that the common thing was if you have an opportunity to remove things from your own yard, you want to make a potential Goyf smaller. So you want to take out your artifacts and your planeswalkers and such. Whereas now, actually, you want to leave the planeswalkers and artifacts and such because Deathrite can't interact with them.
Right.
A lot of the time, you want to leave lands and creatures, or just creatures if you can, because that's often the weakest mode if you're casting a delve threat in the mirror is their life gain. You'd rather do damage to them and have them gain than to be dealt damage to in the mirrors. So yeah, I mean, if you have a way to decide what's in your yard, you definitely want to think about, like, if this game goes long, what do I not want Deathrite to have? But I mean, the flip side of that is sometimes you can't delve enough. You're just going to have 15 Rainstorms in your deck by the time you cast this Gurmag. And so maybe you want to delve away the creatures and lands. You just accept that you're going to be attacked by a grizzly bear every end step for the rest of the game. But you never want them to gain 2 life or have an extra mana. Right. So, you have to make that decision every time. Don't do it reflexively. Just because 90% of the time you activate your Deathrite on black on their end step doesn't mean that those other 10% should be ignored.
Right. Yeah. So in addition to just being sort of like you said, the level 0 like powerhouse moves that everyone should understand sort of intrinsically, then there's all of the next level nuance that you got to also consider in order to most efficiently make use of this creature. Awesome. Well, Kevin, this episode's has been a lot of fun. I think we sort of touched on a swath of all the important topics regarding Deathrite Shaman, and there's probably a ton more that we didn't talk about. Things that we'd need even more expert opinions on than my own to really dig into. But this was good. I think as far as this series of like talking about individual cards has gone, this one has really been eye-opening. Even I realized a lot of things I didn't know or wasn't keenly aware of. So I want to extend a gracious thank you to you for joining us and doing this episode and sharing your experience with Deathrite Shaman.
Yeah, I mean, thanks for asking me on. I'm glad this was. Congratulations on your classic win. I'm glad this was after a good weekend for both of us.
Yes, indeed. This could not have been timed better.
Yeah.
All right, and thank you to all of our listeners and viewers. It has been my pleasure to bring you this episode of Legacies of Allure. If you like what you heard today, please subscribe and feel free to leave us feedback on our YouTube page, or you can message me directly at mtgtraininggrounds@gmail.com. Like us on Facebook at the user MTG Training Grounds. I'm your host, Zachary Cuck. Thank you for joining.